So for the first time a couple months ago, I upped my daily subscription. I upped my subscription to the print New York Times from 1 day a week to 7. And I think my colleagues at New America heard that and said, "Get that man on a panel about the future of journalism. He has his finger on the pulse." I'm lucky to be here with some great thinkers and people who are on the front lines of these questions and dealing with these issues on a daily basis. We have James Bennett, editor of the Atlantic Monthly, Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly, Alex Jones, director of the Jones Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy, Maxine Teller, the founder of Mixed Media Strategies, and my name is Doug McGray. I'm a fellow here at New America and a writer for magazines and radio. I think with that we can begin. Does anybody want to volunteer to go first? Maybe left to right.
Okay, I'll tell one quick story to maybe concretize the dilemma that a lot of us face. It comes from yesterday, so it's quite current. We took down the firewall that protected our magazine content on our site more than a year ago. And yesterday we put the next issue of the magazine, the June issue, up. The cover story for the June issue is, I think, a terrific piece by Josh Schenck about the 70-year Harvard study of a generation of men. Really a unique study that has yielded an incredible trove of research into what makes for a good life and a successful life. This is a piece that Josh and my colleague Scott Stossel worked on together for months and months and months. And we put it up on the site yesterday. David Brooks wrote a column about it in the New York Times. And we did close to 1 million page views to the site yesterday, including 300,000 or so to that story alone in a 24-hour period. And we also saw 50,000 people go straight to hit the print button on the and print out that story. And this is a wonderful success story, and it's worked for us for a while. We've seen traffic dramatically increase to the site over the last year, and we've seen advertising revenue follow that. On the other hand, it's pretty terrifying because we are simply giving away the product of months of careful work and reporting, and it doesn't seem sustainable. So to what Curtis Gans said earlier, I actually think there are more readers, not fewer readers. But the problem is how do we actually convert them into paying readers or find the advertising necessary to support the kind of work we believe in.
Thank you. I'm Alex Jones. I'm director of the Shorenstein Center at Kennedy School. And I'm a newspaper guy by inclination and by history, so I should give you that prejudice up front. I salute Senator Cardin's efforts. I hope that he's successful. I have a somewhat different perspective on both the situation and what really is at stake. It's not that I don't agree with everything he said about the decline of the resources to do the serious political, investigative, bearing witness, the core of serious reporting that newspapers do. I think probably roughly 85% of that work is done by newspapers. It's not that I don't think that's in jeopardy. I do. But I think the situation is a little more nuanced and maybe a slightly bit more hopeful than it has been described by some, and also is more is in jeopardy than simply investigative reporting. Very briefly, let me just say that I think that that newspapers are facing a crisis, and the crisis of newspapers is the crisis of news, from my perspective, largely. I think that what is happening to newspapers is happening because of the digital age. That is the real challenge, and very much is what James has described. That's something that's a riddle that has to be solved by newspapers, but it's been made vastly worse by the economic situation we've been in for the last 6 months, in which advertising revenues have simply fallen off a cliff. I think that the odd circumstance of unintended consequences, though, is at play. In Boston, we have been watching the throes of the Boston Globe trying to save itself by getting rid, in part, by getting rid of some utterly anachronistic labor practices at the newspaper that were products of a much different era. Permanent lifetime job guarantees for highly paid advertising people, for instance. This is something that the New York Times itself, for instance, has not had for many years. And I think that the point I'm trying to make is that the Boston Globe is in the situation it's in part because it is not an institution, albeit one with big overhead, that is operating at the maximum efficiency it is capable of. And I think that what's happening during this economic period of distress is that newspapers all over the country are paring themselves down. They're paring themselves down in part by doing terrible things to their news staffs, but they're also paring themselves down to a fighting weight that will be something that when the economy turns and some of that advertising revenue begins to flow again, is going to put them in a somewhat different situation than they were before, and give them at least a fighting chance to find their way out of into being an sustainably operating entity, even in a digital age. I think also that I want to make the point that what is at stake is not just investigative reporting. With the idea of the genuine demise of newspapers like the Boston Globe, what we have really is the demise of a critical institution, an institution in a place like Boston and all of New England that is virtually, I think, is not virtually, is irreplaceable. And I think that the things that are being put at risk are this institutional presence that serves as glue, the economic strength that gives the reporters for the Boston Globe the power to be able to do the kind of reporting that newspapers like the Boston Globe have been capable of doing, and the presence and power to have impact for their stories. I think that it's worth noting that the great stories that the Boston Globe did on the Catholic Church and the priests that were abusing children, those stories in many cases have been done, or at least some of them have been done, and reported in Boston by the alternative press. But it was not until the Boston Globe put them on the front page and confronted the Boston Globe, the Boston church hierarchy with that they really felt that they had to come to terms. I think that that it is also true that what is in jeopardy and what is genuinely in play is a culture of journalism ethics and a culture of journalism practice based on objective reporting that is genuinely in jeopardy with the demise of newspapers, and that is something that needs to be put on the on the weighted side of things that are apt to be lost, because we are losing not just a journalistic institution in many cases, we are increasingly losing a culture of journalism that had, in my opinion, had much more of a willingness to genuinely operate in the public interest than any other forms of news media. We are in a situation that is fluid, and I think that newspapers should not be counted out. They're not over yet. They may be, but they're not over yet, and I do not think that the jury is fully in. But I think an awful lot is at stake.
Hi there, Maxine Taylor. I'm here to shake it up a little bit. I am not a journalist by training or in practice particularly. I have worked in a number of news organizations on the business side, WashingtonPost.com. I've even worked with Stars and Stripes newspaper. I've worked with USA Today and some others. So I certainly understand the news operations and deeply respect and value the skills of journalism. But my belief is that there is a tremendous cultural shift going on, that the social media tools and technologies that we are experiencing today, Facebook, Twitter, blogs, etc., are catalyzing a tremendous cultural shift from the broadcast era to an era of collaboration. And this is changing our expectations and our assumptions. Our current customers and employees and readers are testing and trialing all of these new tools and technologies, and they're wowed. they realized that there are ways to do things differently. And our future readers and employees and customers, they don't think like we do. They're digital natives. They've only known a world in which everything is available at the touch of a button. Every sports score, every news bite, everything that they want is available. Collaboration is not just their expectation, but it's their instinct. Their desire isn't to simply get information, it's to participate in the conversation. And that's why blogs are so attractive to this audience, and that's why more and more newspapers are putting the ability to comment on their sites. To resonate with current and future readers, I think news organizations have to join the conversation. And that's about moving from a one-way model to a two-way model. And it's also about adding as much value to the conversation as they're taking, and taking as much value from the conversation as they're adding. This is tough. It's tough for us to kind of make this mental shift. And it's tough because we're products of the broadcast era. We all, for the most part in this room, I would imagine, grew up in the broadcast era. We're not digital natives, which means we were born before 1982. And in the broadcast era, big media moderated all of our information, and that's just not necessarily the case anymore. So the challenge that we find ourselves in this world of collaboration as digital immigrants is that we don't know how to collaborate. It's not our instinct. It's not what we grew up with. And it's a little bit of a catch-22, collaboration. So why would you collaborate until you started collaborating, saw the benefit of collaborating? And yet, how would you hop into this sort of cycle? You would never choose to collaborate because you don't see the value in it. And the same is true with social media tools and technologies, interestingly, that you wouldn't choose to try social media tools and technologies unless you saw the value in trying them, and yet you're not going to see the value in trying them until you try them. And so the catch-22 of collaboration and the catch-22 of social media kind of come together and inform one another. And so once you try social media tools and technologies, you kind of have this light bulb go off in your head. You say, gosh, now I see what this collaboration is all about. This is a way to do that. And the more that you start seeing the value from collaboration, and it makes you want to use these tools and technologies more. And so the cycle starts. But it really takes a leap of faith to hop into this. I think of it like an infinity sign, this catch-22 of catch-22s. It used to be that size equaled power and information equaled power. And big media was big size and lots of information, lots of power. I think that the assumptions have changed. The landscape is changing. And size doesn't equal power anymore. Information doesn't necessarily equal power anymore. Rather, information sharing equals power. And I would take that one step further and say that information sharing multiplies power. And this shift is moving us towards a more action-oriented society. We have to be more action-oriented. We have some tremendous challenges in our world: environmental issues, poverty, the list, aging population, the list goes on. So rather than just getting information, I think that we're going to be moving to a world that's much more action-oriented, where we're acting more on that information. And I think that there's the potential for news and journalism to be more of an action catalyst than just an informing voice.
I want to make 2 points that are somewhat anodyne and a little bit contradictory, but true to my experience and worth sharing. The first anodyne point is that necessity really is the mother of invention. The Washington Monthly, when I made an attempt to take it over in 2001, was a for-profit entity. And as one of our original investors in the Washington Monthly, Warren Buffett, said, in name only, we were not ever getting 25% returns. The magazine sort of survived week by week, month by month for 35 years. And I pulled together some investors to buy the magazine. We went through some strenuous negotiations with the founder, Charlie Peters, James remembers those days. Everything fell apart, and instead of trying to keep it alive as a for-profit, we decided to go nonprofit, and it was really the only hope for us. And with the help of some individuals who saw the value in what we were doing, Marcos Kounakis, Jeffrey Leonard, most recently, who will be speaking later, some foundations, OSI and Bill Moyer's Foundation, and most recently Kaufman and some others, we've managed to make that transition. We made it about 8 years before Senator Cardin's bill was put up. So, and it's worked for us. As the digital age was happening sort of in real time, when I came aboard, a lot of magazines that had more funding than we did tried to turn their star reporters into bloggers and create a lot of online content. We did not have star reporters. We hire young and trained, so we went out and hired a blogger who actually had an audience, and that I think we were probably the first to do that. Again, not because we were brilliant, but because we had no other options, and it's worked out awfully well for us, and a lot of other magazines have followed suit. So the point I'm making is that in this moment that feels so awful for those in the mainstream news business, these pressures do, in the end, force you to make changes that, in the end, can let you go forward in a new and vigorous way. And I would like to experiment more with these social networking tools and so forth. So that is one anodyne point. The other anodyne point is you really do lose a lot when you lose established organizations. And the experience that I had with that, Steve is a newspaper man. I'm not. I'm a news mag guy, and spent 10 years at U.S. News and World Report during what I like to think of as the heyday of that magazine. It was never the most prestigious of the three news mags, but it was based here in Washington, and I like to think the most substantive of the three. The reporters did their own writing. They didn't get rewritten in New York. We, being in Washington, had a kind of a tendency toward wonkery and coverage of substantive subjects. Didn't do movie reviews and so forth, and so built up over the years quite a staff of area experts, people who covered the judiciary, covered the courts, covered the FBI, covered the Pentagon, covered Treasury, covered immigration, covered these issues. They went to all the academic conferences. They read all the journals. They had sources in and out of the bureaucracy. They had sources on the Hill. And when a news would happen over the course of the week, and we knew we couldn't just compete by aping what the newspapers had done of reporting what happened, we had to go deeper. We had people who had this unbelievably deep expertise, almost as if they were think tank or academic people, but they had to write 2,000 words in 3 days that would be interesting to the retired lieutenant colonel in Oklahoma. We weren't writing for each other here in Washington. We were writing for the broader public. And it produced just this extraordinary group of people who have, I think John Walcott and Joe Galloway, who covered national security for us, went on to Knight Ridder and was the one news organization that really was ahead of everyone in getting right the WMD problems, the problems with the intelligence prior to the invasion. And it's because they spent years covering the State Department and the Pentagon, and they really, really knew people in the middle levels of these bureaucracies that knew what was going on. And they had the brains and the breadth to ask the smart questions. A number of them came here to New America. Phil Longman, Shannon Brownlee, both of whom have gone on to write some of the finest books on the economics of healthcare. And people throughout Washington, we've got these ex-U.S. News people. Well, U.S. News is, alas, a shell of its former self. It doesn't come out with a weekly magazine anymore. The staff is down to skeleton. We've all scattered to the winds. And that is happening at the other news magazines here in town, where you're seeing fewer and fewer people being hired to cover the issues, as opposed to the day in, day out politics and who's up and who's down. And Steve talked about sort of trying to isolate really what's the problem. And I think we're moving in that direction, but the problem isn't that politics doesn't get covered. Politics, look at Politico. They're doing a fabulous job and they're making money covering politics. During the heyday of Washington, even when the news mags had money and they could hire helicopters to take them, whatever, even then, the bureaucracies didn't get covered the way they should have. And it is sad, I suppose, that there are only 10 people covering Secretary of State Clinton's trip to Israel rather than 30. But that really isn't the problem. The problem is that as bureaus shrink and news organizations, both newspapers and magazines, shrink, they're only going to cover the press conference because they've only got one person covering the Pentagon rather than 3 or 4 with one covering the press conference and the others trying to do the enterprise things. And I'm not talking about investigative reporting exactly. Yes, there's a big role for the big 6-month investigations. I'm talking about the day in, day out enterprise pieces of, I don't know how to describe these folks that we've worked with, but they're kind of reporter intellectuals. They don't fly up here at 20,000 feet, and they're not down on the ground going, writing 6 stories a day. They're writing, fairly sizable stories a couple of times a week, several times a month that really put it all into perspective. They break news, but they analyze too. And if I had to sort of, at least in terms of Washington coverage, this is not local coverage, but in Washington coverage, it is that vital thing that I worry most about.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to start with a big question for anybody who wants to tackle it. In a way, we have to define the problem. Right? The landscape that we're looking at now, is this the future from here to the horizon, or are we between now and something different? Are we dealing with the 5 to 10, 15-year shakeout between now and something that sort of looks roughly like now in a different way?
Well, I don't think anyone would argue that the future is a digital one. I mean, that goes without saying. I think the question is whether that is going to also include a print version of newspapers. Is it going to include institutions that are like the newspapers we know today or the other mainstream news organizations that we know today? And it's certainly not something that's going to be, I don't think that there is any argument about the fact that this is a transition that is inevitable and is happening, at Mach speed.
Mm-hmm. But I guess what I mean is if 10 or 15 years from now we're all reading on little devices that are sort of walled gardens with content piped into them and glossy versions of Absolute and BMW ads, you could have something that's digital where the economics are sort of more or less like they are now. Or you could have a world of free and news on web browsers. And sort of what we do in the next 5 or 10 years, I think, is different if it's one or the other.
You're right. We don't know. It's going to be one or the other probably, or maybe a little of both. I mean, personally, I think we'll be reading newspapers on paper still.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I think that everything is an interim technology. I mean, we never really thought of television as an interim technology. But it is. It's moving us somewhere else. It's moving us to high def. It's moving us to interactive TV. It's just a step. But, when television first came out, everybody thought that was the end-all, be-all. I think it's the same thing. Everything is an interim technology, and everything is an interim stage. We've all thought of the broadcast era as, this is it. This is what we're supposed to be doing. And I'd argue that it's actually an aberration, that this isn't how it was ever meant to be at all. The economics didn't allow for individuals to be the lowest common denominator. News organizations were. Now the tools and technologies exist to enable individuals to be the lowest common denominator, and that changes things. In terms of the economics, I'm not saying I have the answer. Believe me, if I did, I'd be a millionaire, I suppose.
I want to ask you a little bit about comments, because it's it strikes me that comments get less useful in some ways the bigger the community gets. You can get these sort of small specialized web communities where you read 200, 300 comments and it's brilliant, and you can read newspaper comment sites and it's kind of like being trapped in the room with the 10 crazy people on the bus, and then one really smart guy who's trying to get a word in edgewise.
And then you just keep scrolling down, and there's more of it.
And there's more and more and more. And I mean, I guess that sort of drives traffic, maybe. But is there sort of public interest value in that, or is that just something easy that newspapers can do to get clicks?
The technology is not where it needs to be yet. I mean, this is the solution that we've got available now, and at least it's getting people to participate in the discussion.
Right.
But it's by no means a good way of interacting. It doesn't enable the kind of interaction that should be happening, the kind of interaction that happens offline at a coffee, a cocktail party when you both read the same New York Times article. And that kind of discussion is what we're trying to get at through comments, and there's a better way to do it.
What do we need to get there?
Oh goodness, we need the semantic web. We need things to be.
I guess I don't know, but I think people still enjoy reading magazine articles, and in fact, more people read more magazine articles today than 10 years ago, as James pointed out. The problem, it's not that people don't want to read newspaper stories or magazine articles; it's that the connection between that and payment has been broken. That's a different issue than new ways of communicating and collaborating. I don't think that the fact that there's new technologies that allow new media means that the old media necessarily go away. Movies didn't disappear when TV came. They did different things. Radio used to be the source of a lot of dramas and comedies. It's no longer that. It's become talk and music and so forth. But the medium is still there. So I tend to think that there will still be print papers in some way. But actually that particular part of whether it's print or not is I don't think the key. It's whether there are newspaper type stories being published and magazine type stories being published. And I think that there will be, but we see inklings out there of what the technologies are that might pay for it. You kind of alluded to it. As Kindle develops, as people will pay for content on their cell phones, the way they won't pay if they're on their computers. It's two different devices. One you're used to paying, one you're not. So we're all in our business looking at those technologies and wondering, hey, maybe there's revenue there. But I guess my point is I don't think it's necessary that one dominates, one sort of goes the way the dinosaur and the other is the mammal.
Clay Shirky says that newspapers are dead, but journalism isn't. And I think that's the differentiation.
Well, I would like to beg to differ. The future, I think, is that the web is going to be recognized increasingly that as a medium very much unto itself, just the way television was eventually. When television began, news on television was a group of newspaper people reading news stories from newspapers. That wasn't television for very long because it became quite clear that television had its own set of values, its own sort of productions, its own priorities, its own way of choosing stories, developing stories, telling stories, and of presenting, of course. And it was not just a matter of movement. It was a matter of adapting to a medium that had its own set of values as well as its set of abilities. I think that's very much what's going to happen online. I think there's going to be a mechanism that is going to be appealing to the very people that Maxine described, and I think she was quite right about it. I mean, it's a generational change, and it's going to be a generation that wants to get its news not only online, but in a form that is going to suit that set of values, and it's probably going to mean video games as political news, and it's going to mean all kinds of things that we can't even imagine right now, and as far as social networks and so forth. But I think what is also going to happen is that radio will exist, Magazines will exist. Books will still be able to be read on paper and on Kindle. And as far as newspapers are concerned, what is going to be valuable to newspapers if they can survive the next, this terrible economic situation and solve some other economic problems, big if. But if they can do that, I think their future is to be what they are now, except also in an online form, which will not be the same as this other thing I was describing. It will not be a place that everybody goes to. It will be a place where people who care about the kinds of things that newspapers do will go to. And that will be the future. That will be the business. And if they're really smart, maybe they'll run this other thing too and find some young people who can put it together for them. But it will have a completely different set of values in terms of its news judgments, the way it presents, the way it interacts, the way it considers to be, what it considers to be legitimate verification of news and so forth. It'll be a different thing. But will newspapers, both online and in print, continue to be an institutional, contributor to this society? I think there's a real chance that they will. I hope they will.
I'd like to just also throw out the notion that it may be that that in some respects the future of journalism and the culture of journalism might wind up looking more like actually the past. And by the past, I mean the pre-1950s version of newspaper culture. That and setting aside the whole question of the technology and all the wonderful things it will enable us to do, the bottom line may just be that newspaper jobs, as they're conceived in the future, simply won't pay the way they've paid for the last 30 or 40 years. That what's happening now is really a resetting of the cost structure of these very large institutions. Alex described what's happening at the Boston Globe right now, and that's an agonizing process, but the period from the 50s through the aughts may look like a historical kind of anomaly in retrospect, in which newspaper jobs supported an upper middle class lifestyle, and it may be that we're going to go back to a lower paid newsroom that is also, by the way, scrappier, in some ways more skeptical, less comfortable with power, a little. Again, here the Washington Monthly has been a pioneer all these years, maybe without realizing it, because when I worked there, I made $10,000 a year.
It seems like I'm going to ask one more question, then that I think we should go to the audience. It seems like not all forms of public interest reporting are equally endangered. It seems like maybe we could be headed into a golden age of data analysis, and parsing of big documents is something that crowds of amateurs are really good at. It seems like there are other things that are significantly endangered. Maybe you could talk a little bit about if this is a big group of endangered species, what's sort of in the most dire shape.
Well, I think what I sort of said before, that nexus between that sort of informational arbitrage that only comes from somebody spending their professional time getting to know sources and getting to know an area of specialty. And there's obviously a lot that can be done and is being done through the web on that, and you see that in Josh Marshall's site with a lot of the feedback that he's getting and the sources that he's picking up is kind of an extraordinary thing. Firedog Lake having figured out how many times Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded by work in the documents. So there's a lot of opportunity there, but I just over the last 10 years, I've noticed among young people who I've gotten to work with a tendency to stay at their computers and try to get as much information as they can, because you really can work all day and learn things just by being online. It's kind of there is more and more information to mine there, but building relationships with people in little nodes of power and authority requires a different sort of thing, and having their phone numbers and getting to know them and going to their conferences and so forth. So, and really building expertise in an area. I think that's the thing that I worry about.
But those relationships are happening online through social networks, so they don't necessarily need to even meet these people in person. People trust people, and they trust people they know. They don't trust institutions. The reason you trust the New York Times or the Washington Post is one of the reasons, I don't know, people may feel differently, is for the journalists. For you trust that the
Right.
perspective of that person. Maybe you also trust the institution. I don't know if the next generation trusts institutions in that same way. They trust people that they're connected to in their social networks, and that's where they get a lot of news and information.
We got to separate two different questions. There's a question of how the information will be mediated. That is, who's going to refer you to it? Is it going to come because you go to the New York Times homepage, or because your friend Twitters, sends via Twitter that the particular story you should read? There's that question. Then there's the hard question is, how's the content going to be created that you can trust? And that's the tougher question.
And it's going to be very interesting to see whether, as time goes on, people become much less trusting about what appears and what's sent to them. I'm a veteran. I was in a naval veteran on the Coral Sea, and my shipmates and I have a relationship that's endured all these years. I got an email that was sent by one of my group to all of us just last week. That was from a veterans blog. That was the only way it was identified, and it was a quote from Barack Obama talking about how he was going to screw the wounded veterans it was really very artfully done. It was in the voice of Barack Obama. It was utterly phony. I mean, it was sent out. I searched it to try to find where this came from. I could find no source for it. All I'm saying is that I think increasingly people are going to, unfortunately, take a great deal of umbrage at what is sent to them, maybe by friends even, because I think that, again, is what James was saying, how this information is vetted is going to be something that is going to have to be figured out and persuasive.
But just one last thing on this. If you put a story out there and let multiple people contribute to it and have complete transparency, so you're enabling people to vet the facts and identify, contribute, and collaborate, then doesn't the society kind of do that weeding out? It's sort of a Wickonomics model, right?
I think it's a theory that doesn't, frankly, often work that way. I mean, I'll give you an example, another one. This was fascinating to me. Some of you may have gotten an email sent to you by friends during the campaign that was purportedly written by a woman who was a professor in California. It had her name, it had her phone number, it had all of the information about it. And she said, I could not keep silent anymore. It was a detailed account of how John McCain had been at a resort in Mexico and had behaved very badly. He had treated his wife badly, he did all kinds of terrible things. But theoretically, the information was right there. It was sourced. The woman's name was there. She was a real person, except it was phony. It was not true. And nobody had bothered to, I think increasingly they're going to, but I think that is I think that it would be naive to think that the power of the web in misinforming people is not something that is looked on as a great opportunity by a lot of people.
Well, let's go to some questions. In the front there, you've been raising your hand for a while. I'm sorry. Sorry. You can go next.
Just a follow-up question real quick.
Oh, sure.
I understand your model.
Could you speak into the mic?
Sorry. I understand the model that you're talking about in social gathering, but how do you do that in Pakistan or Iraq? Or how do you do that if somebody takes hostages in Oklahoma City and it's not news gathering what you're talking about. It is definitely one of the roles that newspapers have traditionally played, but it's not deep public interest news gathering.
You're talking about how do you get into that level of depth to build a story collectively, or do you mean how do you break news in places like Pakistan? Twitter's been a tremendous news breaking operation. It certainly doesn't go into depth, and it certainly isn't necessarily trustworthy. You got to go back and check, what is this? Where's it coming from? But in terms of notifying you that something's going on, Twitter's a wonderful resource. And then you follow up on CNN and MSNBC and newspapers to get the full story. I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I speak?
Yes.
My name Dmitry Novik. I fortunately represent myself. So I'd like to say that I don't remember who said this, that progress is driven by good leadership or crisis. In Russian we have proverb, it was not fortune, then misfortune helped. We have misfortune with Bush presidency, now we have some design fortune. But it's not the point about the main theme of this conversation. If you know Norman Mailer,
I'm sorry. If you could, what was it that you
yeah,
wanted to ask?
my
Okay.
question, I'd like to speak something that my question will be understandable, otherwise it's not the question. And he was asked what he will choose only one thing to do better for America, and he said, eliminate commercials. I think the basic problem of today's crisis, and crisis is good, we will go from the crisis better than before, but we need to understand what's the root of the crisis. And the root of the crisis is marriage between commercials and news journalism. It's the problem. And the only way to solve this problem is technology, nothing else. No regulation, no policy, no...
I'm really...
So my
I'm so
question
sorry.
is this. My question is this to all of you. Do you think that journalism as creative art, edited creative art, is better than bloggers with rumors? It's my questions.
I think that bloggers have a function. Bloggers are about opinion. Journalism has always included opinion, but for the most part, bloggers are not about reporting, and reporting is the essential discipline of journalism.
Yes, Phil. And thanks so much to everybody for keeping questions really quick, because there are so many hands, and we're not going to get to everybody unless we move fast.
Thank you. I'm Phil Longman from the New America Foundation. In a previous life, I used to work for the St. Petersburg Times in the 1980s and early 90s. And our problem at that time was we were so fantastically profitable that this family-owned newspaper was constantly being threatened by takeovers from chains and such. And we created this Pointer Institute to sort of hide our profits. And that worked for a while until the Bass brothers found a loophole, and we wound up paying this gigantic green mail to make them go away. And my question is, just to evoke those times, is during this long period in the 80s and much of the 90s, the profit margins on newspapers were just fantastic. And yet we had these downsizings and dumbing down of coverage, basically to satisfy Wall Street and the chains. And my question, I think, Mr. Jones, you might be able to speak to this most efficiently, is what role has ownership, and chain ownership in particular, played in getting us to here? And what lessons can we learn from that era about the kind of appropriate ownership structures that might bring a truly independent media back?
Well, I think lesson number one is that there are very few Nelson Pointers. Nelson Pointer was the man who basically owned the St. Pete Times, did not want it to fall into corporate hands, and created the Pointer Institute so he could avoid that. And it was and remains a superb newspaper, in my opinion. I don't think there's any question that greed, greed is rampant, was rampant in the 80s and in the 90s at the newspaper industry. But it was compared to what, greed? I mean, I disagree with the gentleman who spoke before. I think that a strong commercial basis is absolutely essential to good journalism because it gives the strength to be able to not be intimidated by public officials and others who would or lawsuits and others that would try to silence you. But I think that the newspaper industry as a whole, albeit that it was lavish profits time in the 80s, was not nearly as lavish in its profits, for instance, as local television was. Local television was, when it was started, generally in the hands of local people, and many of you may remember local television stations that really did wonderful public affairs work, all kinds of innovative things. But when those people sold, they generally sold to investors who paid high prices and who wanted to make them very profitable and have made them very profitable, did make them very profitable. If newspapers were making 20%, local television was making 60%. And at the same time, local television news, as I think you will all agree, although it's where most people say they get their news, is a kind of form of tabloid journalism that avoids politics, policy, anything controversial, anything that involves investigative work that is not a sweeps week kind of investigation. They don't want that because that was their model. The newspaper model was one that included profitability, but it didn't put profitability above everything else, and it had other values as well.
Do you think public ownership was a mistake for newspapers?
Yes, my
ownership?
name is Gary Ratner. I published a letter to the editor in the Post a couple months ago. A free press is not free, really, on this very topic that you're discussing. I'd like to follow up on the things that a couple of you have said and then ask a question, and it'll be pretty quick. Senator Cardin said that the current business model based on subscriptions and advertising is not working. It's not generating enough revenue. I think we can all agree to that. James Bennett said that a major reason why the subscriptions are failing is because the magazines and the newspapers, though they're the source of the hard work and many of the key stories of the news, they're giving it away. You're giving away this expensive news content for free on the internet. I think we all agree we're moving in a digital age, but as Mr. Glastris said, the connection between reading and payment has been broken. So there's a real convergence here. My question is, why do we not address this problem directly by having Congress create a limited antitrust exemption that would allow newspapers and magazines to get together and agree to charge for access to their valuable news content on the internet, thereby building up the subscription base? And if that means having to change the way people feel about paying for the internet, that's just too bad.
Do you mind if I plunge in? Just quickly, I don't think I said it wasn't working. What I meant to say is it's not working yet. I'm not yet persuaded it won't ultimately work. And I can see a lot of organizations moving to some sort of tiered model where they are beginning to charge for certain sorts of content. It obviously, to a degree, it works now for the Wall Street Journal, and where you offer high-value content that is particularly valued by a niche of readers, I think you have a strong chance of being able to charge for that. We're seeing lots of people already do that on the web. Where it becomes a big problem, I think, particularly is for the big newspapers serving a general interest readership with a wide variety of news. And to the extent they begin walling off that content and charging for it, I think they create a space for a new lower cost provider of high quality news to come in and take the audience away. And I wasn't being glib before. I hope I didn't sound glib about the resetting of the cost structure of the industry. It's terrible. I mean, I'm a newspaper guy, and it's horrible watching these jobs go away and newsrooms getting thinned out and less copy editing, less fewer layers of editing. Some of that's not. For those of us who work there, you can sort of appreciate the change, but that's a huge problem for them. I mean, I don't think that they can simply get together and say we're going to charge for our content now and expect to survive in the long term.
I actually want to cut in line briefly and ask you to. I mean, more than of all the intellectual public interest magazines, The Atlantic has invested in the web, I think, in the biggest way, and embraced free and are there lessons from your experience in that?
Well, that's why I say it's not necessarily. It's not. It's kind of working for us. We also went the blog route. It made sense for the Atlantic in a way it doesn't probably for a lot of other magazines, and created a kind of platform on the web for a robust debate among what I consider a very original, highly intellectually honest group of bloggers with very different points of view, and they argue about politics and culture and so forth. And the magazine drives up every month, and we kind of heave this content to our bloggers, and they tear it apart and push it out there into the web. And the stuff that works well for us in the magazine also works really well online. And we've seen vastly expanded readership as a result of this, and hopefully new readers being introduced to the magazine. Subscriptions have been going up to the print magazine during this period, and our ad revenue has been growing as well, substantially online, and that's all encouraging. The story I told at the beginning, though, I was trying to explain my own anxiety about this because I'm not sure. Right now, we're very much this is an experiment that we're still in the middle of, and I don't know if it's going to work or not.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Mark Nadell. I wanted to follow up on the last two questions with you, James, because yesterday I went to David Brooks' piece. I went directly to Josh's article. I printed it out. What I would have liked is the option to donate the way I donate a tip to a food server whose service might have been lousy, but that generates more than $40 billion a year. If you could teach the American public, whether in schools or otherwise through the media, to voluntarily contribute, then you're not walling off anything, but you're doing something valuable. I would vote, and I would have contributed a recommended $2. I don't know. Have you explored that?
We're talking about various approaches internally now, and that's actually one I hadn't considered. I mean, I'd love to have your contribution in the form of a subscription to the magazine, where special promotions are available all over the site.
I didn't do that is I felt guilty. I would pile up all these stories I wanted to read, and it made me feel embarrassed that I wasn't reading them. So I ended my subscription. Seriously.
Well, again, and another model for us may be if we believe that there's something so distinctive, as I do, about the quality of a big magazine story that people will be willing to pay for it. One model might be a lower cost online-only subscription for the magazine content, with the blog content continuing to be free. There's some other things we should be doing, like selling. When you print out that page, there's no reason an advertisement couldn't appear next to it. I don't think it would destroy your reading experience, and we might be able to monetize the content that way. So these sorts of things we are discussing. I hadn't considered donation. We're not nonprofit. We're not a charity.
There's a restaurant when I tip.
And the next time I moderate something, I may bring my tip jar. Yes, back there.
Hi, my name is Jean Brooks. I'm from the Center for Public Integrity. One of the things that I wanted to just point out is that, and this is probably an unpopular statement, but there was a failure of the press in the last administration, and from an industry that is about accountability, I feel like there's a lack of accountability in that. So that's one point. But the other point is that the most recent statistic that I can find, which is from the Annenberg Public Policy School in 2007, is that 74% of editors' positions are male. And I think part of the reason why you're seeing, one of the reasons why I don't subscribe but that I print individual articles is because I'm selective of the news that I consume. And I think that there's a lack of diversity in your editing, or not in your editing, excuse me, but editing in general. And I think that part of this conversation needs to be the diversification of power positions as we transform from old media to new media. And I also did just want to point out that as both a woman and a young person who consumes news, I really don't want to see print die. I think that print is very important. I consume news digitally, but I think that there's a definite value in being able to hold the newspaper and consume it from front to back, but that because there's this lack of diversity, I sometimes have conflicting views on having a regular subscription because I don't always agree with the content or the quality of the content. So I would just open that up to how that is part of your discussion. I mean, I know even this panel itself, women were an afterthought in putting it together. And so I guess I would just encourage all of you as we move forward to include a more diverse voice in the conversation.
So are there diversity issues or quality issues?
No, I think that all of these things, I think you're right. I think that there should be more. I think that there is compared to the time when I began my career in journalism, there has been a sea change in terms of the number of not just women, but people of color and people of all stripes in most news organizations. But, I take your point, and I think that losing people like you is something that newspapers simply cannot afford.
We have time for maybe one last question, maybe two if people are really fast. Yes.
I want to start by disclosing my conflict of interest. I'm a former newspaper reporter, and I'm seeing, dozens, hundreds, thousands of people leaving the industry. So my question is, when you start with the premise that journalism isn't dead, and we expect journalism to continue, what do we want to say to the generation of journalists right now who are struggling professionally? Is it a message of, it was a good run, find something new, or is there a way that they should try to stay in journalism? And as a second part of that question, a lot of these people are finding jobs at nonprofits and government. Do you think that there's going to be more flexibility moving between journalism and non-journalism, where in the past I think there was always a feeling that it was a one-way trip?
I think that journalism is, as a vertical, as its own separate thing, is changing. I don't think that that's dead, and I don't think that that's going away, but I also think that there's a horizontal aspect to this, where journalism becomes more woven into the fabric of society. And so you see trained journalists who have the tremendous investigative skills, the ethical training, and all of the wonderful things that make a great journalist, being more a part of all types of industries and jobs. I think that it's a way to get our country, our world, to appreciate that type of skill set a lot more than it currently may. And second, it's a way to get jobs for these folks. I also, back to that concept of the tip jar, which fits into this, because it's changing the training of our society, both on the content side and on the business side, and training people to think differently about how we respect and value news, in that we want to pay for it, in that we want to incorporate it into other aspects of our industries. I don't think it can remain as only a vertical. I think it needs to be integrated as more of a horizontal capability as well.
I think that's probably a good point to end on, but it was a great panel, and thanks to all the panelists.
I have to know that I'm not going to read that article until I can